Hello cyberspace, my name is Garrett Mills and welcome to episode 11 in my PHP development tutorial series. In this episode we're going to continue our look at object-oriented programming in PHP, which we started last time. If you haven't, I would recommend starting at the beginning of this series so you get the foundation concepts built up, especially since we've been building on sort of the same project and the same web app since episode 1 of this series. So you can do that by clicking the eye in the top right hand corner, but if you've done all that, then let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so I've got PHP Storm opened up to the object-oriented file that we were working on last time, so this is the one where we defined all the different accounts. And one thing I want to do is I want to start out by clarifying something I wasn't very clear on last time, and that's the difference between a class and an object. So if you remember our analogy of the blueprint for a house, where classes define the blueprint, and then when we instantiate it, we build the house, so to speak, so that the variables where we've created a new instance of a class, that is the actual house being built from the blueprint. So a class is a blueprint for a house. It hasn't been created yet. The house hasn't been built yet. It's just a blueprint. So this on its own could not function as a house because it hasn't been created. But then once we create the class, we create an object of the class, we actually build the house. We create an instance of it. So classes are just the straight up class definitions. Objects are when we've actually created a new instance of that class. And so I just wanted to clarify that because it's important for what we're going to be talking about next, and that is static versus non-static methods and properties, as well as visibility. So we're going to start out by talking about visibility. You may have noticed in the last video that in front of all of these properties and in front of all of these class methods, we use the word public. And I said we would talk a little bit about it later. We're going to go ahead and explore the concept of class method visibility. So this public keyword denotes the visibility of whatever attribute we're defining. So there are three main visibilities. There's public, there's protected, and then there's private. So the one that gets used most often and the one that you're probably most familiar with is public. A public attribute or a public method is something that can be accessed from the class anywhere. So if I define a public method in the account class, I can call it from an object directly. So say we've got this public method update balance. Well, I can call that directly from an account. I can call update balance with the new balance. And so it can be accessed from outside the class or from outside the object as long as it's being accessed properly. And the same goes for these attributes up here. So I can access the attributes directly from outside the class just by using the attribute name or whatever attribute. So as long as I'm accessing them properly, they can be accessed externally from the class. But let's say I want to make it so that you can't directly access the balance variable. Say I want to make it so that you have to use update balance and say we define another public function get balance to return balance. So let's say we don't want this attribute to be directly accessible. We don't want to be able to directly do this anymore. We want the user or the developer to have to use the update balance and the get balance functions. Well, the way we can do this is we can set balance to be not a public attribute, but a protected attribute. And a protected attribute is something that is accessible from within the class, but not outside of the class. I can access it from inside these functions defined within the class, so I can access it directly from the getBalance function because the getBalance function is within the account class. But if we look down here, where I try and access it from outside the class, from an object, then you see PHP Storm is showing an error because member has protected access. Basically what that means is because balance is a protected attribute, we can't access it directly from outside the class. So if I wanted to set the balance, I would have to use the public function update balance. Now, one important thing to note about the protected visibility, is it allows this attribute to be accessed from within child classes as well. So if we wanted to, say, define a function in the charity account class which extends the account class, public function get charity balance, we can do return this balance. And because this is still being accessed from within a child class, it's still from within a class, it allows us to access it from a protected scope, from a protected visibility. And because we're accessing it directly from within a class still, the charity account class extends the parent class, then we're still allowed to access it. So I can't just say red cross balance equals 100, because that would be accessing the balance variable externally from outside the class. But what I can do is say red cross get charity balance. And this isn't going to throw an error because when charity balance is called, the balance attribute is being accessed from within the class. But say I wanted to make it so that child classes couldn't access this balance variable. It could only be accessed from within the specific parent account. Well, that's where private comes in. So rather than protected, we use private. So this makes it so that balance can only be accessed from within functions or methods defined within the specific parent class, which means that this get charity balance, this function will no longer work because I can't directly access the balance attribute from a child class. It has to be done from the same class it's defined within, which means I can't use this get charity balance function anymore. So visibility is incredibly useful when it comes to protecting attributes and protecting methods that don't really need to be accessed from other classes or other objects, such as the update balance and the get balance functions, or the balance attribute. So this balance attribute, because we've defined a get function and an update function, we don't need to allow direct access to this attribute. And what that allows us to do is it adds a layer of protection, because you can't just go and destroy the balance attribute. It's always going to be there. You have to use the update and the get balance functions. And so it's just useful to sort of safeguard your code to make sure that it's going to behave the way you want it to when it comes time to actually go into production. Now the next thing that we're going to talk about is scope resolution. Now that's a big fancy term, but it's basically talking about whether or not we're accessing attributes from an object or a class. And this is why it was important that at the beginning of this video we clarified the difference. So the class is the blueprint, the object is the actual house. So if you're accessing something from an object, you use the arrow operators. So that was the dash and then the greater than sign. This tells PHP that you're accessing a method that is defined as only being accessible from an object. So all of these attributes and all of these methods, they can only be accessed from an object. So I can't go like this. I can't go account and then do the arrow operator and then call get balance. That won't work, because what this arrow operator is saying is it's saying that in order to call get balance, it needs to be called on an object, not a class. So all of these functions that we've defined, so get charity name for example, it's a public function that is only accessible from the charity account object once it's been assigned to a variable. So we can come down here and we can call get charity name on the red cross variable, because the red cross variable has been created as an object. But it is possible to define attributes and methods in a class that don't have to be called from an object. these are called static attributes or static methods. And they use this operator that we saw a little bit of in the last episode, the double colon, also known as the scope resolution operator. What this operator denotes is that we are accessing a method or an attribute that exists in the class that doesn't have to be accessed from an object. So let's say we want to set it up so that it automatically assigns an ID to each of the accounts. The way we do it now is we manually type in an ID, auto-increment it each time we create an account. But we could automate that away so that it starts at one number and goes up by a number each time. But if we were to just define a normal, say, public next ID equals 1555, every time we initialize a class, that's going to be the same. So we want a variable that's not going to be specific to an object. We want a variable that exists in the class and is accessible through the class. So we're going to create an attribute in the class. It's going to be a public attribute, and then we're going to use a new keyword. This is the static keyword. Now, the static keyword just tells PHP that this attribute or this method can be accessed directly from the class. We don't have to create an object to access it. Then we create the variable, so next ID, and then let's assign it a starting value. So say we want it to start counting at 1000. Now what we want to do is we want to define a method that's going to get the next ID, and it's going to auto increment this up by 1. So down here we can create a static method. So we use public static function get next ID, and then in here we need to return this next ID and then set it up by 1 so that the next time this function is called, it auto increments the ID for us. So if you remember down here, when we needed to access a class attribute, we would use the variable this followed by the arrow operator. However, that won't work for static variables since they need to be accessed using the scope resolution operator, the static operator. The way we get static attributes from within a class is using the static object. So we use static, then the 2 colons, so the scope resolution operator, and then the name of the attribute with the $sign. So next ID. So it's important to note that this static keyword here and this static keyword here are being used differently. This static keyword up here where we define the attribute or where we define the method, that is telling PHP what the scope or what the access scope of this method is. Whereas this static keyword here is telling PHP that we're accessing the account. It's like an alias for account, but it's being used from within. It's similar to this. So what we want to do is we want to temporarily get the next ID. We want to store it in a variable ID. Then we want to increment this next ID up by 1. So static next ID, and then we're going to use the 2 pluses operator. And the 2 pluses just tells it to increment by 1. It's the same thing as saying static next ID equals static next ID plus 1. It's the same as this, it's just shorthand for that. So it's an incredibly useful thing to know. Then we want to return the old ID. So what this is going to do is it's going to get the current number here, it's going to store it in a variable, then it's going to increment this up by 1 so that the next time this function is called, we get 1001, 1002, etc. And it's going to return the first number. So the first time we call this, it's going to return 1000. The next time we call it, it'll return 1001, 1002, etc. So let's say we want to implement this so that we don't have to give an ID in our construct function. So let's remove the ID. And instead of setting the ID to the attribute, we want to call the getNextID function. So to do this, we call static and then the getNextID function. And then down here we need to modify the construct function in our charity account so that it no longer requires the ID attribute. So now what we can do is we should be able to remove all of these IDs from our accounts, and they should automatically have an ID assigned to them. Just say we want to get Jane's account ID. So by the time we get to Jane, so Bob will be 1000, Joel will be 1001, Jane should be 1002. So we're going to find Jane, and we're going to var dump the ID from her account. So now if we jump over to this object-oriented page in Firefox or whatever web browser, and we refresh it, we see that Jane's account number is indeed 1002. And say we wanted to check the Red Cross's account number to see, it should be 1003. So if we refresh this, 1003. So there we go. We've created a variable that is specific to the account class, but is not dependent on being accessed from an object. It can be accessed from the class directly. So that's a very useful thing to do if you need to define a function or an attribute that is specific to some class, but isn't necessarily specific to an object. So like the getNextID function, for example. This is also used a lot in web app development when you're creating objects to represent things that are stored in a database. So say I have a user class, and in that class I have a function, a static function that creates a new user. Well, that create function wouldn't be any use if we had to create an instance of the class, since its entire job is to create a user. But if we create a static class to create a user, we call that static class on the user class directly, and it returns an object of that class. And so it's a useful way of organizing your functions that are specific to a class, but not necessarily specific to an object. Now the last thing we're going to cover in this episode is going to be magic operators, or magic methods, or magic attributes, or whatever. They're referred to a lot of different ways. These are methods that PHP treats a special way, or they're called at special times. Now we've already worked with one of these a little bit, and that's the construct method. The construct method is a magic method, and it's special because PHP calls it at the time the class is created. So we don't have to tell PHP to call this construct function. It's already called for us when the class is created. So there are a number of other magic attributes that classes have, but we're just going to take a look at a couple of them today. So obviously the construct function is one, and that's one that we're fairly familiar with, so we're not going to spend much time on that. But another one that we want to take a look at is a magic attribute, and that is the class attribute. So let's say we have a function that we're just going to use for testing, public function get class name, and say what this is going to do, obviously, is it's going to return the name of our class. So we want it, in this case, we want it to return account. Down here we would want it to return charity account. So what we're going to do is we're going to return, and then we are going to use the magic method, or we're going to use the magic attribute class. So to do this, we use 2 underscores, class in all uppercase, and then additional 2 underscores. So what this is going to do is this class variable is set to whatever the proper name of the class is. So if it's an instance of the account class, this is equal to account. If it's an instance of charity account, it's going to return charity account. So let's test it out. So say we're in a normal account. Say we want to get the name of a normal account. So we're going to get Bob get class name. So now if we jump over to Firefox and refresh, we see we get account because Bob's account is an instance of the account class. But let's say we want to get the name of the Red Cross account. Red Cross get class name, jump over to Firefox, refresh, we see it's also account. Now that's not what you would expect, because we're calling it on the red cross, you would expect it to return charity account. However, the reason it's returning the class attribute as account for the charity account is because we've defined it within the account class. So the class magic attribute is specific to where it's defined. So say we moved this down to the charity account and we called it in there. Now it's going to say charity account because since we're accessing the class magic attribute from within the charity account class, it's set to charity account. So this is useful if for debugging, or say if you wanted to do some checking to make sure that class names didn't contain an error or any illegal characters or keywords or whatever. And then the last magic attribute that we're going to take a look at now is the Destruct method. Now the Destruct method, similar to the construct method, is called when a class is destroyed, when its instance, when the object is destroyed. Now normally this is when all the PHP execution is stopped. So when it gets to the end of all the PHP, down here on line 68 or whatever, after it's finished all of this, it automatically destroys all of the PHP resources, in this case all of our classes. And so on each of the classes, the destruct variable or the destruct method is called. So we can test this out by extending the public function destruct. So we're going to go ahead. So inside the destruct function, we can do anything that we want to happen right before the class is destroyed. So let's just say we want to echo out that the account class for, and then the name was destroyed. So now what we're going to see is at the bottom of our page, we're going to see account class for each instance of account. So Bob's account, Joe's account, Jane's account, and Red Cross's account. That's all going to be printed at the bottom of the page after all the PHP is executed, because that's where it destroys the instances of the classes. So if we jump over here, we see account class for Red Cross was destroyed, Jane's account, Joe's account, Bob's account. Now the classes are unset or destroyed in the reverse order that they were instantiated. So Red Cross was created last, so it's the first to be destroyed. Jane was created second last, so it's second to be destroyed. But let's say we wanted to destroy an object before PHP had finished executing. Say up here I want to destroy Bob's account before we even create Joe's account. Well, we can use a built-in function of PHP. This is the unset function. And so if we unset Bob, what this is going to do is it's going to destroy the instance of account that exists within Bob. It's going to destroy this object. And so you'll see it'll call this destruct function. So the order will now read Bob's account was destroyed, then Red Cross, Jane, and Joe. So if we jump over to Firefox, Bob's account was destroyed, then the rest of the PHP executes, Red Cross, Jane, Joe. This unset function is useful if you need to make sure that a class is cleanly destroyed before, say, you instance something else in that variable, or you create a different instance of Bob's account under the name of a different variable, and you want to make sure there are no duplicates. So we're going to go ahead and remove this unset variable for now, just to kind of keep our code clean. Now the last magic method we're going to look at in this episode is the TwoString method. Now this method is a little bit confusing at first, but it's easy to pick up on. So we're going to go ahead and implement it first, and then I'll explain what it does. So let's jump up to our account class, and we're going to create the function public function 2 underscores TwoString. Now in this function, we want to return some string. So let's say we return the balance. So So what this function does is when an object containing an instance of the account class is treated like a string, it's going to return the balance. So if we were to treat Bob's account like a string, so say we echo Bob's account holds Bob. Since we're treating the object account as a string, if we didn't have this TwoString method implemented, this would throw an error because you're trying to convert a class to a string. They're completely different things. But once we define the TwoString variable, PHP knows what to do when it's treated as a string. So if we treat the Bob object as a string, instead of throwing an error because of the class, PHP is going to act like Bob is actually whatever the output of TwoString is. So this is the same thing as saying Bob TwoString. This is essentially what PHP is doing. It's calling this TwoString method here so that an error doesn't occur. So if we jump over to Firefox and refresh the page, what you would expect to see is the string Bob's account holds and then whatever the balance of Bob's account is, in this case 250.55. But if we jump over to Firefox and we refresh the page, what we see is a fatal error telling us that string hasn't returned a string value. Well, this is because you have to keep in mind the variable types that you're storing. So when we define Bob's account, we defined the balance with it, so 250.55. But we sent PHP this balance as a float, and a float is a number, not a string. And so that float is what's being stored in balance. Balance is not a string, but a number. And so that's why we're getting an error when we try and call TwoString. It's because balance is a number, not a string. Now the way we can fix this is by casting it to a string. And we do this by, in parentheses, putting string before it. And what this is going to tell PHP is whatever this variable is, turn it into a string before you return it. So now if we jump back over here, we see Bob's account holds 250.55. So when we treat the Bob object as a string, the TwoString function is being called, it's returning balance as a string, and that's being inserted into our string here. Alright guys, thanks for watching episode 11 in my PHP development tutorial series. As always, I'll be down in the comments if you need help with anything or if you want to show off something you built, so you can connect with me down there. You can also connect with me on the web through Twitter, email, my blog, Google+. Links to all that stuff are down in the description below. And I'm going to try something a little different. I want to do a shout out to a project that I think is really cool, and it's called Tab for a Cause. And if you haven't heard of Tab for a Cause, it's really great. You should check it out. Basically what it does is on whatever browser you're using, Firefox, Chrome, etc., it replaces the new tab page with its own custom page, and this page has ads on it. Now you might be thinking to yourself, that's kind of dumb, why would I want more ads? I'm on the internet. Well, what Tab for Cause does with the revenue from these ads is they raise money and donate that money to selected charities. And so for every tab you open, you earn 1 heart. And then you can donate your hearts to a selection of charities that you can choose from. So the Foundation to Decrease World Suck, Water.org, Save the Children, etc. You can pick what charity. And they distribute the ad revenue to those charities based on the ratios of the hearts. And so it's a really awesome project, and they're doing some really great work in supporting these charities, and you should really check it out. And if you use the link in the video description below, not only do you get to sign up to help out all these great charities, it also allows me to give a small kickback to these charities as well. Anyways guys, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the next video where we're going to take a look at interfaces. And as always, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.